Do you see this black car at the upper right? It's going to smash into the gray car. That's why you don't work on the street. That could be your body. This is a video on how to inspect and adjust the drive chain slack on a 2011 Ninja 250. We're going to be showing every single step in detail, starting with lifting the bike up on the rear stand. The lever extends and retracts on this rear stand, as you can see. We're going to use the stand with spools that screw into the swing arm, but you can also use the stand directly on the swing arm by reversing the adapters. This is a trackside rear stand purchased at Cycle Gear for between $40 and $60. I've used it for about 2 years and it works really well. Look on the swing arm of your motorcycle to find important information such as chain care, chain slack, and other things like tire pressure. These stickers allow mechanics to do routine work without having to constantly refer to service manuals. Put the bike in neutral and rotate the rear wheel to find the tightest part of the chain. Measure the chain slack where the chain is tightest. This is an X-ring chain and it has a lot of life left in it, so it doesn't really have a lot of tight spots. Measure the chain slack at the same part of the side plate in the upper position and the lower position. For example, if you're measuring from the bottom of the side plate when the chain is pushed down, measure from the bottom of the side plate when the chain is pulled up. Remove the axle nut cotter pin. These pins actually don't come off as easily as you'd think. It's difficult to get the slots in the axle nut to line up with the holes in the axle. But just work with it and have patience, and it'll eventually come out. This cotter pin is especially difficult to remove because it's probably larger than an OEM pin. I haven't seen OEM pins, so I can't compare. I got this pin at Ace Hardware for about 25 cents. You can also use a cotter pin remover. I haven't used these before, but they may work. You just have to be careful that when the pin comes out, you don't fall backwards. Loosen the axle nut to allow the wheel to move back and forth so that we can adjust the chain slack. This is a Harbor Freight breaker bar. It's $13 with a lifetime warranty. It makes short work of this axle nut. You can also use the owner's tools, but the apparatus is hard on the palms, and it doesn't fit on the front wheel axle nut. Some axle nuts you can loosen with a normal size wrench, but I've never been able to loosen this axle nut. with anything but a breaker bar. The axle nut is now loose. Now we're going to loosen the lock nuts at the ends of the swing arm to adjust chain slack. Hold the adjuster nuts steady with one wrench and loosen the lock nuts with another wrench. Try to keep the adjuster nuts from moving, but don't worry if they do. You can just readjust them later if necessary. Do the same on the other side of the swing arm. Prevent the adjuster nut from rotating by holding it with one wrench and loosen the lock nut with another wrench. Again, try to keep the adjuster nut steady so it doesn't rotate. To show how the parts work, I'm going to remove one of the adjuster blocks from the swing arm. This shot is for demonstration only. You don't have to do this to adjust the chain slack. In order to remove the adjuster block, we must remove the axle nut, the washer, and the alignment indicator, and push out the axle and pull. We don't need to remove the axle completely, but only pull it just enough so that it clears the adjuster block. As you can see, the adjuster block moves freely in the swing arm. When the axle is inserted through both adjuster blocks, they move the axle and wheel back and forth. Of course, you must move both adjuster blocks evenly so that the wheel remains straight. For lack of a better name, we'll call this rectangular piece of black metal a swing arm cap. This is the adjuster nut. Now we'll reinstall the axle. Notice you have to loosen the adjuster nut and then push the apparatus forward to move the adjuster block towards the front of the bike. When the adjuster nut is tightened against the swing arm cap has nowhere to go because it presses up against the swing arm, so this forces the adjuster block to move to the rear of the bike, which moves the axle and wheel towards the rear of the bike, thus reducing drive chain slack. If you want to increase drive chain slack, you must loosen the adjuster nut, but again, when you tighten the adjuster nut, it forces the wheel towards the rear of the bike. But when you loosen the adjuster nut, the wheel will not be forced towards the front of the bike. To move the wheel towards the front of the bike, you must push the wheel by hand, loosen the adjuster nut, push the wheel forward, and repeat. Again, you must move both adjuster blocks evenly. Most likely you will only have to tighten the adjuster nuts, not loosen them, that is, decrease chain slack, not increase it. Do not attempt to move one block only, as seen in this video. You may damage the brake disc or wheel bearings. To make sure that you are turning the adjuster nuts evenly, check that the marks on the alignment indicators are between the same markings on the swing arm on both sides of the motorcycle. Now we move to the alignment indicator on the other side of the bike because there's better lighting. Here is the mark on the alignment indicator. When the mark reaches this cross, it means your chain has stretched too far and will need to be replaced. Here are three other marks for reference. To demonstrate how the alignment indicator moves, I'm going to loosen the adjuster nut completely. Again, this is just for demonstration. You will most likely be tightening your adjuster nuts slightly, not loosening them completely. Notice that as you loosen the adjuster nut, the alignment indicator moves to the left on its own. This is because there's a small amount of tension in the chain being released. But after the tension in the chain is released, loosening the adjuster nut will not move the alignment indicator. In order to move the alignment indicator, you have to push the wheel forward like so. Notice that the mark on the alignment indicator is at the leftmost mark on the swing arm, which indicates that the chain slack has been maximized. Now we're doing the same thing on the other side of the swing arm. Again, you have to push the wheel forward to increase chain slack. Now we're going to tighten both adjuster nuts to achieve the proper drive chain slack. Remember to turn both adjuster nuts evenly to keep the wheel straight. Notice that the marking on the alignment indicator is moving towards the right, which means that the wheel is moving towards the rear of the bike, decreasing chain slack. As tension increases on the chain, it'll become more difficult to turn the adjuster nut. Remember, you should be turning the adjuster nut on this side of the swing arm and the adjuster nut on the other side of the swing arm at the same time to keep the wheel straight. Here's what it looks like on the other side of the swing arm when you tighten the adjuster nuts. Again, you must tighten both adjuster nuts evenly to keep the wheel straight. In this video, it doesn't appear that we're tightening both adjuster nuts evenly because we're showing each side of the swing arm separately. But you must tighten both adjuster nuts at the same time to keep the wheel straight. Before we set the proper chain slack, we'll demonstrate one more thing. In order for the alignment indicators to produce an accurate reading, we must make sure that the rectangular swing arm caps are up against the swing arm. It's also extremely important to understand that the rectangular swing arm caps must be up against the swing arm when checking the chain slack and when tightening lock nuts and the axle nut. Notice again that if we loosen the adjuster nuts, we have to push the wheel forward because loosening will not force swing arm caps up against the swing arm. But there is a better method for making sure that the rectangular caps are up against the swing arm. Lodge an object between the chain and the sprocket and rotate the wheel slightly. Notice that the rectangular caps move up against the swing arm. Hold the wheel in place with your hand or foot. As long as the wheel is held in place, the swing arm caps will remain tight against the swing arm. The only downside to this method is that you must remove the object between the sprocket and chain to measure the chain slack. After tightening the adjuster nuts to achieve proper chain slack and wheel alignment, tighten the lock nuts up against the adjuster nuts. Again, it is probably best to lodge something in between the rear sprocket and the chain to make sure that the rectangular swing arm caps are up against the swing arm while we tighten the lock nuts. Double check that the caps are up against the swing arm. While holding the wheel with your foot, use one wrench to prevent the adjuster nut from turning and use another wrench to tighten the lock nut up against the adjuster nut. In order to prevent the adjuster nut from moving while tightening the lock nut, you may need to exert force on both wrenches. This may take a little practice. Again, make sure that the swing arm caps are up against the swing arm. The lock nuts do not require a large amount of torque, so don't strip them by over-tightening. Again, as you prevent the adjuster nut from rotating with one wrench and tighten the lock nut up against the adjuster nut with another wrench, rotate the wheel slightly with your foot and hold it there to put force on the object between the sprocket and the chain so that the swing arm caps are held up against the swing arm. We're now ready to tighten the axle nut. This is a Craftsman 1/2 drive clicker type torque wrench. It has Newton meters and foot pounds. It was on sale for $40 at Sears. Unlock the wrench by turning the red barrel, then rotate the black barrel to achieve the proper torque setting. I have all three Craftsman clicker type torque wrenches. They work very well, but the downside is that they only have 1-year warranties. Torque wrenches at AutoZone, O'Reilly's, and Harbor Freight have lifetime warranties, and they're less expensive. The service manual for the 2011 Ninja 250 requires 72 foot-pounds on the axle nut. This is probably true for all 4th generation Ninja 250s, but check your service manual just to be sure. We're now at 72 foot-pounds. Lock the wrench by turning the red barrel the opposite direction. Before tightening the axle nut, lodge an object between the rear sprocket and drive chain and rotate the wheel slightly to put force on the chain and sprocket. Then hold the wheel in place with your foot. Again, this ensures that the swing arm caps are up against the swing arm and that your alignment reading will be correct. Double check that the caps are indeed up against the swing arm. While holding the wheel in place with your foot, tighten the axle nut. Be sure to hold the wheel in place with your foot the entire time that you're tightening the axle nut, so that the swing arm caps remain up against the swing arm. These Craftsman torque wrenches can be used for right-handed or left-handed threads. Be aware that you may need to hold the other side of the axle with another wrench to prevent the axle from rotating. This time it was unnecessary. You'll hear a clicking sound when the wrench reaches the proper torque. There's the clicking noise. Just to be sure, reposition the torque wrench and apply torque again after you hear the clicking noise. Do this about 3 or 4 times to make sure the proper torque has been applied to the axle nut. You can release your foot from the wheel and check again that the rectangular swing arm caps are up against the swing arm. If you held the wheel in place with your foot, then even after removing your foot, the swing arm cap should be up against the swing arm. Be sure to remove the object from between the sprocket and the drive chain. Double check the chain slack. Rotate the wheel to find the tightest part of the chain. Remember that chain slack may be decreased after the axle nut is tightened and when the rear stand is removed. Measure slack at the same part of the side plate in the upper position and the lower position. For example, if you're measuring from the bottom of the side plate when the chain is pushed down, measure from the bottom of the side plate when the chain is pulled up. This chain is slightly loose. You may want to decrease chain slack a little more than that seen in this video. Achieving proper chain slack takes practice. You may have to loosen the axle nut and try again. Things like tightening the axle nut and setting the bike on its side stand affect chain slack, so have patience. As you can see, the slots on the axle nut don't quite line up with the holes in the axle, so a cotter pin will not fit. Especially these large cotter pins I purchased for 25 cents at Ace Hardware. If you can't fit the cotter pin, the service manual says to tighten the axle nut until a slot lines up with a hole in the axle. But never tighten the axle nut more than 30 degrees beyond the required torque. We're going to use the breaker bar to line up the slots at the holes in the axle. But unfortunately, what will happen is the axle will rotate with the axle nut, and I'll make no progress lining up the slots on the axle nut with the holes on the axle. As you can see, the cotter pin still doesn't fit. It takes about 3 or 4 more tries before I realize that the axle is rotating. Again, no change. And again, no change. And again, we still don't have a change. The only thing that's happening is the axle nut is rotating with the axle. So I'm going to hold the other side of the axle with the wrench. Because the apparatus is rotated significantly, I had to reposition the camera. Now the slot is almost lined up, but not quite. One more rotation. Now we can fit the cotter pin through the slots and the holes. Bend the cotter pin like so. Again, this cotter pin is probably a little larger than the OEM cotter pins, so you may want to cut the ends so that they don't stick out so much. I usually just leave the long ends as is. To make sure that the wheel is aligned and rotating smoothly, put the bike in neutral and rotate the rear wheel. Then apply the rear brake. Repeat this process multiple times to make sure that there's no binding or drag on the rear wheel. Remove the motorcycle from the rear stand. Remember to put the kickstand down. The service manual says to check the drive chain slack when the motorcycle is resting on its side stand, so double check the chain slack when the motorcycle is on the ground. You can find the tight part of the chain by putting the bike in neutral, holding on to a frame attachment, and pivoting the bike on its side stand. This allows you to rotate the wheel to find the tight spot of the chain. Again, measure slack from the same part of the side plate. If you're measuring from the bottom of the side plate when the chain is pushed down, measure at the bottom of the side plate when the chain is pushed up. Again, this chain is slightly loose, so you may want your chain a little tighter. Again, I'm not sure if all 4th generation Ninja 250s require the same degree of chain slack, so check your swing arm stickers, user manual, or service manual to be sure.